The first time I worked with U.S. Army soldiers, they got me hammered. They would make my drink disappear when I got about halfway through and replace it with a brand new one. And so I ended up having about 10 whiskeys that night. I even ended up with my head underneath the bar at one point, with a captain yelling into my ear, sharing his stories with me. I luckily ended the night late enough that there was nobody to witness me crawling down the hall to my room. I woke up the next morning, took about a bottle of Advil, and went upstairs, and lo and behold, there were all the soldiers from the night before sitting up staring straight. And it was only later that I learned that the ability to do this was a prerequisite to be an officer in the Army. And I started my presentation when one of them asked me about the hero's journey. I must have mentioned it the night before, not that I could remember that. And they wanted me to elaborate on it. And this is how I ended up in a room full of combat veterans, talking about the destroyer archetype. And I was explaining how you go on your journey, on your hero's journey, and you encounter the destroyer and you lose something precious, or maybe you lose everything, you lose your way, your sense of purpose. And everyone in that room was acutely aware of their relationship to the destroyer. But what they didn't know was that there was more to the journey, that there was actually a roadmap out, that you could encounter the lover archetype, that you could reignite your passion, you could find your purpose again and meaning. And in doing this, in integrating your experience, you could recreate yourself. You could create yourself anew, and thus return as a ruler of yourself. And as I said all this, the room was heavy with possibility of what it could mean to heal. And I remember looking at the young captain named Dan, who had been yelling in my ear beneath the bar the night before, in his very tight, hard cruise cut. But that was belied by his very soft eyes that he was staring off into space with as he listened to me talk about this. I left that presentation convinced I had discovered the secret to solving the entire military's PTSD issues. And a couple months later, I was lucky enough to have lunch with a 2-star general named Dana Petard, a very forward-looking general who was a division commander in El Paso. And I basically ambushed him at lunch with this idea of helping soldiers take their hero's journeys to help them reintegrate home. And he went for it. And so a couple months after that, I'm back in El Paso with my sister and colleague Kate and my another colleague Amanda, and we run a bunch of veterans through this program. And I have to tell you, it was a disaster. It totally failed. And coming home and thinking about it, there were a couple of reasons. One is that when you focus on combat trauma, you're not necessarily covering everybody. A lot of soldiers have trauma from before they ever join the Army. Another story I was told had to do with the technology. There was one soldier who spent her entire deployment in Kuwait, and it was her job to watch drone feeds. And so she would have to watch battles in real time and watch soldiers getting shot. But because she was safe, she felt she had no right to trauma. But the biggest mistake we made had to do with an Army campaign called an Army of One. It was a marketing campaign, and it did not work. Because people do not join the Army for themselves. They join the Army to be a part of something greater. They join the Army for the camaraderie. And here we were saying, separate out and take a journey by yourself. And it wasn't going to work. In fact, soldiers get into trouble when they're isolated. That is when they're most in danger. And this was actually illustrated in the Iliad, of all places, 2,500 years ago. Towards the end of the story, Achilles is chasing the Trojan hero Hector around the walls of Troy, and for reasons we won't get into, Hector is wearing Achilles' old armor. And so the visual effect is stunning because it is Achilles chasing himself. Achilles is hunting himself down. Meanwhile, all the other soldiers from both Troy and Greece have left the battlefield, and so it is Achilles in isolation. When we are alone is when we have the danger of doing the most harm to ourselves. And we forget this all the time. It's not just true for soldiers, it's true for all of us. If you want to know how well a kindergartner is going to make the transfer to first grade, don't look at their academic record. Find out whether or not they have a friend. Because having a friend is a better predictor of your academic performance at that age. And it continues with us as we grow up in programs that help disadvantaged youth get into college. The ones that focus on individual performance and resilience have a 90% success rate at college admission, but some of them will have college graduation rates as low as 30%. But other programs that put the kids into groups and send those groups to college together, they'll have a 90% graduation success rate. In every culture around the world, when someone dies, the community comes together to lend support. We are resilient in groups. Resiliency is not an individual's strength. We are resilient in our communities. Resiliency is a property of our human networks. And we forget this. We forget it even amongst our own neighbors. I live in Oakland, and parts of Oakland are greatly challenged, and this story comes from a corner in one of those challenged parts of Oakland. It was a corner where people would dump mattresses, old TVs, they would graffiti the walls, they would litter, nobody cared. And one day, one of the neighbors went out and he bought a Buddha, 3-foot Buddha from Home Depot, and he figured out a way to attach it to the concrete. And for a while, nothing happened, but then one day somebody left an offering, a piece of fruit. And then somebody else came along and left flowers. And someone else swept up around the Buddha. And one day somebody built a little hut around the Buddha, and more flowers were left. And people stopped dumping their old mattresses and TVs. People stopped graffitiing. The neighbors started to clean up their own yards. The Buddha taught that we are all connected, that the idea that we are separate from one another is an illusion, and that we should take care of one another because of this connection. And the Buddha, the statue of the Buddha there, reminded the neighbors of this. It encouraged them to their better selves, to taking care of one another. When soldiers are deployed on the battlefield, the battle itself acts like the Buddha. It reminds the soldiers that they are in this together and that they need to take care of each other. And they do. Soldiers have an amazingly supportive network when they're deployed. But then they come home and they forget. And they stop taking care of each other. Because coming home is supposed to be easy. But it is not. When I came home, it was my community that came together for me. That Achilles metaphor, that interpretation, that's not mine. That is from my favorite professor, Michael Brent. And when I got home trying to figure out what went wrong, it was my brothers, Dove and Alan. It was my sisters, Kate and Darcy. It was Tripp. It was Whitney. It was Major Ryan Krantz. It was retired Colonel Steve Rutkoff. It was Ori. It was Lisa. It was Court. It was Rosenberg. It was my sweetheart Tara. It was Sarah. It was my community that I spoke to that helped me figure out what we had done wrong and how to make it better and made me resilient. And that is what we're going to go back to the 1st Armored Division with and start working with them, not in disempowering them by removing them from their culture and telling them to go get help, but rather by empowering them to help one another, just like they did on the battlefield, to help one another now that they're home. The Sangha in Buddhism is the community of fellow travelers who are there to support you in your seeking of enlightenment. In Judaism, there are certain prayers you cannot say without a minyan, a group of 10 people. Religions understand that there is strength and power in these groups. We want to bring that same strength and power to our veterans, and perhaps to our underprivileged children, to our more blighted areas of cities. Most stories tell you everything you need to know at the beginning, but you don't know that. That night that I was getting drunk with the soldiers, Dan, the one with the soft eyes, who was yelling into my ear under the bar, he was telling me his war story. It was there in the cacophony of all of his friends that he felt safe to share it. We need to create these communities of resilience, because the journey only ends when we return. We only become heroes once we have returned, and we can only truly return together.